and welcome back to Forward Thinking. We're now joined by David McFarland, an expert in mental wellness and suicide prevention. David is also a member of the PCL Advisory Board and assists in our structuring around this very issue. So, David, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, what exactly do you do in all that I just described?
A very common question. So, look, I've been in the media, entertainment, and sports space for 3+ decades, so a long time. I know I don't look that old, but I am. And I'm also, a social impact advisor and producer, writer in film and television, and do some public speaking, specifically at the intersection of equality and mental health and suicide prevention and the sport and entertainment industry. But essentially what I do is I bring together cultural influencers, powerhouse brands, funders, coalition partners, not just to create sort of groundbreaking original content, but also build sustainable movements that deliver social impact and measurable value across various media platforms and product portfolios. So I have basically two big companies that focus on this area. I have DLM Entertainment Group, which is a diversified media entertainment company with ventures at those intersections, pop culture, and we're dedicated really to creating sports and entertainment content that inspires and compels social change. And I have DLM Impact Group, which is a social impact consulting and management brand development firm that specializes in media entertainment and the sports sectors, engaging with leading influencers, elite athletes, artists, social enterprise, nonprofit startups, powerhouse brands, again, to change the way people think about and respond to social issues. Really a big area of focus of mine right now is sort of this mental health and suicide prevention space, not only in entertainment, media, and sport, but for all Americans.
How exactly did you get into this? You mentioned it's been a few decades of work now within the space, but what exactly motivated you and drew you to this, and how'd you get into it?
It's a great question. So I began my career in media and entertainment, and back in the 90s, I was in New York City at MTV Networks, where we really were focused on pop culture and brands reaching audiences and sort of speaking a language to young people and creating content and programming that really spoke to the voice and gave a voice to young people in America. I work at a number of other networks throughout my career. And then I was part of helping to build and develop the Trevor Project, which is the leading crisis and suicide prevention intervention crisis line in the country, specifically for youth and LGBT youth. And so that was at a time where there was an issue, but it really wasn't that public. And then around 2010, 11, we saw a string of young people starting to take their lives. And they caught the headlines of the media. It wasn't really represented in the media correctly in terms of how we told these stories about people taking their lives, what led to contagion. And a lot of that fell on my shoulders in terms of what are we going to do about this in America? So at that point in time, it was a lot of pressure. And I made the decision that this needed to go to the highest office in the land, went to the White House, and that's what activated everything we know today around the policy and sort of the conversation around LGBTQ youth suicide and mental well-being in general. And, bullying, quite frankly, was not on the radar screen. So as a former elite athlete myself and my interest and work in sport, this is very near and dear to me on a lot of intersections and a lot of layers. So I took my combined entertainment and sport background and sort of began to focus on this effort, which has led me today and taking it to a whole new level and turning it into stories. Because I just sort of feel like through storytelling, and particularly unscripted or documentary films, and their portrayal, sort of the shared humanity, can and do inspire change. And even if that change is incremental, it's still nonetheless real change. And my change is to really affect mental health and suicide prevention. So as someone actually said this week, to me, and I never really thought about it in this way, is that, David, you led the nation's effort around LGBT youth suicide. Now you're confronted with leading the effort around mental health and suicide in the wake of this pandemic, and actually, quite frankly, in the aftermath of this pandemic, because this is not going away.
What do you think some of the how do you fight the stigma for athletes, particularly now in a sense where, in football, you have to be tough, super hard, strong. Basketball, you got to be tough, hard, competitive. But then there's this stigma that comes with, recognizing that you may need help. So what do you do? What do you say to young athletes who are, chased or faced with that dilemma of the stigma around mental health?
David, that's actually is a really good question, and it's something we certainly don't talk enough about. But what we do know is that mental health and mental issues affect, at minimum, 1 in 3 elite athletes, right? And every year. So the elite sports culture, with its heavy training demands and commitments and constant drive to improve performance, and only serves to sort of heighten that risk level. So we know through current evidence that shows that the stigma is the main reason why elite athletes with mental health issues don't seek the help that they need. And that's a big problem. And that's part of the systemic issue, the institutional issue. And we're not treating the athlete as a whole athlete, right? We're treating them on the physical side for optimum performance, but the mental side is really, really critical, right? And we constantly tell our athletes and young people to be mentally tough, mentally pushed, mentally prepared. But where the heck is the mental, support that we need, from the governing bodies to the coaches to the teams? So, stigma is the most commonly reported factor that's preventing our athletes with mental health issues and stopping them from seeking help. And in the belief that mental challenges is a sign of weakness, to your point, rather than the hallmark of a winner, and would be seen as such by peers and managers and coaches and the public in general as weak, right? So these factors, play into sort of the gender stereotyping of man up or you're not man enough. And we need to get beyond that, because until we get beyond those type of barriers, our younger athletes, that's just gonna continue to keep them, for lack of a better term, tucked quietly away and unseen, for fear that they're going to lose their position on their team, for fear that they will lose their scholarship, for fear that they won't get a contract at the elite level, for fear that they'll be discriminated against or biased from their coaches and their former players, and they lose their position on the team. I mean, all of that are real risks that stigma sort of attaches. So it's a big problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, being in professional sports for as long as I was, we didn't get the mental wellness, mental health thing didn't come until 2011, 2012. That's when, in my opinion, things sort of came on the radar. In that, I mean, we started to learn about certain things, and guys started to be a little bit more open about some of the things and the challenges that they were facing. But how can an athlete identify that he's having a mental health crisis or he's in the midst of a mental health issue? Because sometimes, we may feel like, well, it's just a part of the game. It's just a part of what we have to go through. So how does a guy recognize that he's in a moment or in a time where he may be facing a mental crisis and may not know it?
To your point, it is an everyday occurrence, right? Just like physical injuries are everyday occurrence.
Right.
Except the stigma doesn't sort of allow us to talk about it, feel it, experience it. So current state of play in this country, quite frankly, in the world, to support the elite athlete and the mental health and well-being has centered mostly around mental wellness, literacy, and awareness of the signs of mental health issues. And that's good. Such awareness is necessary, but it's not sufficient to address the varied mental health needs of that very athlete that you're talking about.
Right.
And it's a reason why I have called for a new model in the sports industry of intervention and really truly committed to developing a framework and a backbone of a comprehensive mental health initiative to promote mental health and well-being. And those that work in the space know how to respond to the needs of the athletes that are at risk. And also, quite frankly, to move beyond the stigma so it becomes part of the natural conversation.
Right.
It's okay to have. So, early detection for intervention, and knowing what the signs and symptoms are of mental health issues is essential in the elite sporting, context. But, these athletes, if they're not getting the information, if coaches are not creating safe environments and allowing this conversation to happen, unless they take it upon themselves to, do their own research, nothing's going to change, right? So we in the sport industry need to develop a framework and a model of care to support these athletes. And that's one of the things that I've proposed. And quite frankly, the sports governing bodies and teams and coaches and owners and administrators all need to really be committed to this, just like they are in sinking millions and millions of dollars into the physical side. It's time to put this into the mental health side of things. So the whole athlete exists, not just a piece of it.
In terms of timeline, how important is it for not just the awareness piece, but also the resources to be made available to athletes at a younger age? Because it sounds to me like by the time you've reached the professional game, you may have already passed several critical warning signs. You may already be dealing with these issues and not even realizing it. And at that point, to compare it to a physical injury, you may already know how to exist with it, so you don't address it. So how important is it, whether it's high school, college, or even earlier than that, is it to have a national initiative in place that everybody follows?
It's critically important, right? And look, we know the topic of mental health and suicide is dark. It's complicated. It isn't the most sympathetic cause. People are afraid to really talk about it. And that's precisely why it needs our attention, like here today, what we're doing. And it needs the attention of the caretakers of the sports industry. And that goes all the way up to the C-suites of, the leagues, the institutions, whether it's, at the collegiate level, at the Olympic level, at the professional level, and at the age group level. It is no secret that this is a major public health crisis in this country. It is suicide is the second leading cause of death among our young people, 10 to 34. So if that fact alone people need to be paying attention to that, period. But the resources, look, if we look at the collegiate level, even at the professional, well, quite frankly, at all levels of sport, you walk into beautiful facilities that you see weight rooms and facilities and training rooms that support the physical side. Where does the athlete go in their environment for mental health, mental wellness checks, right? So if you look at the collegiate system alone, how many sports psychologists actually live within the athletic departments? I think it's around 30, right? Now, how many in the university, college, collegiate area do we have big sports, right? And so that athlete the majority of athletes are dealing with mental health challenges at some point in time in their career. They walk into the training room for the physical side, but where do they go for the mental health side? What they're told now, for the most part, is go across campus and go to the general population for counseling. First of all, few are going to do that, right? Because that's outside their family. We know that in the sports environment, that your sports environment is your family, right? And so that's sort of where you live. So in the context of whether it's collegiate or Olympic or professional, that sports psychologist and expert needs to be there and available to athletes, not just 9 to 5, 24/7, right? Those people contemplate taking their lives, in the later parts of the night, if not, very early in the morning past midnight, 1 or 2 in the morning. So they need to be there when the need is great, regardless of whether they will go to that sports psychologist for fear that they may be exposing something that will get to their coach or to the athletic director or the owner. At least they know it's there. And it also is a sign that that institution has made a big commitment to mental wellness, right? And that part of the athletic training area doesn't have to be centered around mental illness, because mental illness is a piece of mental wellness and mental health. Everyone can benefit from being more mentally prepared. And the athlete, particularly the elite athlete, has all these levels of challenges above and beyond just the sport, right? They have everyday life. They have their academic responsibilities, their economic responsibilities, their family responsibilities. The list goes on. So, until there's a true commitment at the highest levels of sport to mental wellness, we're still going to be living with this challenge in a big way that's going to affect not only the athlete individually, but the team and various sports entities itself.
Right. Circling back to what you discussed earlier about now the national initiative that you've been behind in terms of the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention and your COVID-19 response rollout, which was first made public last week. What can you tell us about that? What exactly is it and what you're aiming to accomplish with it?
About 6 weeks ago, before the pandemic really got to where we are today, I had this vision, and I believed that really could change the game for our nation and for the mental well-being of all Americans, right? Last Tuesday, that vision moved ideas from paper to action. The launch of this U.S. National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention response to COVID and in the aftermath of the pandemic is what actually launched. This launch is a highly coordinated U.S. national response in a moment where we know a mental health crisis is upon us, and it's already in front of us. And it is basically a all hands on deck, coming together, highly coordinated, unified effort, both on the public sector side, meaning all the federal agencies, from the National Institute of Mental Health to the CDC, to the Department of Justice, Department of Defense, VA, et cetera, that are really coming together for the first time to share and coordinate efforts around this. And in the private sector side, it's really the private sector coming together for the first time. So all the NGOs in the mental health and suicide space, and all, corporate America, big philanthropy, and, big entertainment, big media, big sport, to help build an effective response to mental health and suicide in the U.S. And, we know that this issue and this public health crisis cannot be solved by one federal agency or one NGO alone. It really takes a dream team. So the dream team is led by the esteemed Dr. Josh Gordon, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, to coordinate the leadership of this national effort. And I felt like this needed to live someplace best in class. And so the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, which is the nation's leading entity in this country to bring the public and private sector together to address mental wellness for all American, is taking a leadership role to lead this effort. And so fortunately, we've been able to bring the brightest minds and experts that this country has to offer and develop solutions that truly address both the short-term and long-term mental health consequences in this pandemic. It's a challenge, and it's never been done in U.S. history, but this is an opportunity to really sort of put mental health and mental wellness in the forefront of the national conversation, and really have a real meaningful conversation of what are we going to do, because it's on the radar screen of every American, quite frankly, every citizen around the world right now.
And for those seeking more information, where could they go to find more information about the response and the resources being made available through it?
You can go to the National Action Alliance website, which is actionalliance.org, and there is a link to it. You'll probably, I think this automatically pops up, but that's where you would start. and go. And there's ongoing. We're gonna start to see more of this conversation happen across the board. So, and the idea is what ideally I would love to do, and for the listeners, is to create a massive national media strategy and campaign to the likes that this nation has never seen before, to put it front and center in the living rooms all across the country, so people have a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of compassion and empathy, that there are people out there that care and that are doing something about this to address this issue.
Certainly a worthy cause, and you definitely have our support in doing so. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Our listeners will hopefully take away some meaningful lessons from it, and we can keep this conversation going throughout the month. We'll have a segment on mental wellness for each episode during the month of May. Thank you again, David, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. We appreciate it.